A woman who matched with a stranger on a dating app vanished after agreeing to meet him in a quiet suburban neighborhood in 2016. Police initially believed she'd simply ghosted another adult who chose to walk away. No signs of struggle, no crime scene. But the official theory never explained the unanswered messages or the phone that went silent mid-conversation. 7 years later, during a routine evidence audit, investigators noticed something overlooked the first time. A single digital trace, mundane on its own, suddenly reframed everything because it proved she never left alone. The notification lit up her phone just after midnight, a soft vibration against the nightstand that cut through the quiet of her apartment. She hadn't been asleep yet. She rarely was anymore. Instead, she lay on her side, scrolling absent-mindedly, half convinced that online dating was just another loop of small talk and disappointment. Then, she saw the words she'd been waiting for. "It's a match." She smiled despite herself. Friends would later say she'd been cautious, almost guarded after a string of relationships that never quite landed. She wasn't reckless. She didn't meet strangers impulsively. She liked conversation first, liked getting a sense of someone through words before faces. And this match? This one felt different. His messages were quick, thoughtful, almost disarmingly normal. No over-the-top compliments, no pressure, just humor, shared interests, and an easy rhythm that made the hours pass unnoticed. Finally, she texted her best friend the next morning, someone who can actually hold a conversation. The chat logs showed nothing alarming at first glance. They talked about work, favorite late-night food spots, bad first dates they could now laugh about. He asked questions, he remembered details. When she mentioned she hated crowded places, he suggested something quiet, low-key, public, but not loud, a small neighborhood area she already knew. By the third day, the idea of meeting didn't feel risky, it felt reasonable. The plan was simple, early evening, a short meetup. "If it's weird, I'll bail," she joked in another text to her friend. "I'll share my location, don't worry." That was her nature, responsible, considerate. She charged her phone fully before leaving. She wore a jacket even though the weather was mild, tucked her keys into her bag the same way she always did. Routine mattered to her. It made the world feel predictable. At 6:42 p.m., she messaged him, "On my way." He replied almost instantly, "Perfect, I'm already here." Her location data later showed her moving steadily through familiar streets. No detours, no hesitation, just a straight line toward the meeting spot. She sent one more message as she arrived, a casual update meant for reassurance more than anything else. "I'm here." What happened next would become the center of 7 years of questions. At 6:51 p.m., she typed another message. It was never finished, just a fragment, half a sentence that stopped mid-thought, as if her attention had been pulled away suddenly. After that, silence. At first, no one panicked. Missed messages happened, dead phones happened. The dating app still showed her profile as active, but unmoving. When her friend didn't hear back by later that night, she assumed the date had run long or gone badly. By morning, the concern crept in. Calls went straight to voicemail, texts stayed unread. Her phone, which rarely left her hand, was suddenly unreachable. By the afternoon, her family was involved. By evening, police were notified. The man she'd matched with was cooperative when contacted, calm. He told officers they'd met briefly, talked, and gone their separate ways. "Nothing unusual," he said, "just two adults who didn't click." There was no sign of a struggle. No witnesses stepping forward. No immediate evidence of a crime. On paper, it looked simple. But as investigators would later realize, the story of her disappearance didn't begin with what happened after she arrived. It began with the assumption that nothing happened at all. And that assumption would haunt everyone involved, because somewhere in those first quiet hours, something critical had already been overlooked. By the second day, her silence no longer felt accidental. It felt wrong. Her phone records told a story long before anyone realized how important they were. Investigators would later reconstruct the timeline minute by minute, watching her digital presence fade instead of disappear all at once. At 6:42 p.m., her phone was alive and responsive. At 6:51, it was still connected, still typing. Then, something changed. Not abruptly, not like a device powering off. More like someone slowly pulling a plug. The first officer assigned to the case stood over a cluttered desk, scrolling through logs, eyebrows tightening. "This doesn't look like a dead phone," he muttered. Dead phones went dark instantly. This one lingered. Her last confirmed data ping showed her still in motion. The signal drifted slightly, just enough to suggest movement beyond the meeting point. It wasn't fast, it wasn't erratic. It was steady, almost controlled. Then the pings stopped altogether. When police contacted the man she'd matched with, he answered without hesitation. He didn't sound nervous. If anything, he sounded prepared. "Yeah, we met," he told them. "Chatted for a bit. Didn't really click. She left first." "Did you see where she went?" an officer asked. He paused, just long enough to register. "No. I didn't really pay attention." There was no physical description of her departure. No mention of a car, or a direction, or even a goodbye. Just separation. Clean. Forgettable. Too forgettable. Digital forensics teams pulled what they could from her phone carrier. Text timestamps, app usage, battery statistics. The results were confusing. Her phone didn't shut down immediately after that last message. It remained powered on for nearly 40 minutes, long enough to send data, but not enough to respond. "She didn't ghost," one analyst said quietly. "Something interrupted her." Surveillance cameras in the area offered little help. A few grainy clips showed her arriving. None clearly showed her leaving. A parked vehicle blocked one angle. A poorly lit corner swallowed another. Each missing frame felt intentional, even though everyone knew it wasn't. Her dating app activity became the next focus. Investigators subpoenaed the company for server logs, logins, messages, background processes most users never thought about. What they saw unsettled them. Her account showed a brief background sync minutes after her phone supposedly went offline. "That shouldn't be possible," a technician said. "Unless the phone was still moving with signal." The theory of a voluntary disappearance began to wobble. Friends were interviewed next, their voices cracking as they described someone who never vanished without warning. She'd never missed work without calling, never left town without telling someone, never ignored messages from her family. And yet, officially, that was still the working explanation. Adult woman, no evidence of force, chose to disappear. The man from the app stuck to his story. Same words, same calm delivery. When asked why he deleted his dating profile the next day, he shrugged. "Felt weird after all this," he said. "Didn't want the attention." Police noted it. Then let it go. Weeks passed. Tips dried up. Her face faded from local news. The case file grew thick but stagnant, filled with data that didn't quite align and statements that felt incomplete but not provably false. One detective scribbled a note in the margin of an interview transcript: "Phone behavior inconsistent with walkaway." It wasn't enough. By the end of the month, the investigation slowed. Resources were redirected. Leads were labeled unlikely or unsubstantiated. Her digital trail, once so alive, was boxed up and archived, reduced to charts and timestamps no one had time to question deeply. But buried in that data was a quiet truth no one recognized yet. She hadn't just been last seen in person that night. She was last seen online, still connected, still moving long after the story said she was gone. And whatever happened to her didn't happen in the dark. It happened in plain digital sight, waiting years for someone to notice what it was really saying. By the time the word missing was officially attached to her name, the momentum had already begun to slip. There was no obvious place to search, no trailhead, no abandoned car, no frantic voicemail left behind. Just a woman who had walked into an ordinary evening and never emerged from it. Police reports used careful language, no immediate indicators of foul play. Adult female, voluntary absence cannot be ruled out. Each phrase sounded neutral, reasonable. Together, they built a wall that quietly stalled everything. Search efforts were brief and restrained. Officers canvassed the neighborhood where she'd last been seen, knocking on doors, asking residents if they'd noticed anything unusual. Most hadn't. A few thought they'd seen a couple talking. One mentioned a car idling longer than expected but couldn't describe it. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable. Her family pushed back hard against the theory everyone seemed to settle into. She wouldn't just disappear, her sister told an officer, voice shaking with frustration. She wouldn't leave her job, her friends, her life without a word. That's not who she is. The officer nodded sympathetically. He'd heard this before. Families always said the same thing. And yet, cases like this so often ended exactly where they seemed to be heading: nowhere. Behind the scenes, detectives continued reviewing digital records, hoping for a break. But the longer they stared at the data, the stranger it felt. Her bank accounts remained untouched. No withdrawals. No travel purchases. No activity of any kind. Her social media stayed frozen, last updated hours before the date. It was as if she'd been switched off rather than choosing to leave. Then there was the phone. Analysts noted again that her device never registered a formal shutdown. The battery hadn't drained naturally. It simply stopped responding, mid-cycle, like a signal swallowed whole. One technician described it bluntly: "Phones don't behave like this unless something interferes." Still, without physical evidence, the case stalled. The man from the dating app faded into the background as well. After his initial interview, police found no direct contradiction they could challenge. He hadn't been aggressive. He hadn't fled town. On paper, he'd done nothing wrong. His name remained in the file, but quietly, almost apologetically. Then, weeks later, one small detail surfaced and disappeared just as quickly. A back-end report from the dating app showed an unopened message sent to her account after the time she was presumed gone, not delivered, not read, just there, time-stamped and untouched. An officer flagged it, then dismissed it. Glitches happened, servers lagged. It wasn't enough to reopen doors already closing. By the third month, the case was formally reclassified. No longer active investigation, now inactive pending new information. Her photograph was moved from the bulletin board to a drawer. The file was boxed and labeled with a date, a name, and a word no family ever wants to hear: cold. Life moved on, around the absence. Her friends stopped checking their phones every few minutes. Her coworkers stopped expecting her to walk back through the door. Holidays came and went, each one heavier than the last. Her family learned to live with a silence that never resolved into certainty. But uncertainty has a way of settling into people differently. For most, the case became something sad, but finished a mystery without an ending. For one detective, it became something else entirely, a loose thread that refused to stay buried. He'd catch himself thinking about it late at night, replaying interviews in his head, circling the same unanswered questions. Why did her phone behave the way it did? Why was the timeline so clean, so empty? And why did the story of two people simply parting ways feel rehearsed rather than remembered? Years passed. Technology changed. Databases improved. Evidence once considered too messy to analyze became searchable, sortable, visible in new ways. The world didn't remember her disappearance, but the data did. And 7 years later, during a routine audit meant to clean out old files, that same detective would open her case one last time. Not because he expected to find anything, but because something about the way she vanished had never felt accidental. And buried in the digital noise, ignored, misread, and underestimated, was a detail that would quietly prove she hadn't disappeared on her own at all. 7 years was a long time for a case to sit untouched. The cardboard box holding her file had been shifted 3 times, once during a departmental reorganization, once during a move to digital archives, and once more when an evidence room clerk decided cold cases older than 5 years should be relocated to the back. Each time, the label stayed the same: her name, the date, a life reduced to ink and paper. Most people had stopped opening it, but Detective Aaron Cole hadn't forgotten. He was older now, slower maybe, his hair thinning at the temples. Retirement loomed close enough that colleagues joked about countdown calendars. Yet some nights, when the station was quiet and paperwork stretched endlessly, he found himself thinking about her unfinished sentence. About a phone that didn't die the way phones were supposed to die. "Still bugging you?" a younger officer asked once, noticing the familiar file on his desk. Cole didn't answer right away. He just stared at the pages. "Cases don't bother me," he finally said. "Patterns do." Officially, he had no reason to reopen anything. There were no new tips, no witnesses coming forward, no remains discovered. But technology had moved faster than policy. Databases that once required manual cross-checking were now searchable in seconds. Background app data previously dismissed as noise could now be reconstructed into timelines with frightening precision. So Cole made a quiet request. He asked for the raw digital archive tied to her disappearance, not the summaries, not the reports. The original data server logs, back-end app records, cell tower handoffs, the kind of information no one had patience for 7 years earlier. The analyst who pulled it raised an eyebrow. "This is old stuff," she said. "Most of it's already been reviewed." "Reviewed isn't the same as understood," Cole replied. Late one evening, long after the building had emptied, he sat alone with a cup of cold coffee and began scrolling. At first, it was exactly what he expected. Timestamps, coordinates, technical jargon, nothing that jumped out. Then he slowed down. There it was again, that odd stretch of activity after her last message. The phone shouldn't have been transmitting. Everyone had agreed on that. And yet, the logs showed faint background communication continuing longer than anyone remembered. Cole leaned closer to the screen. "What were you doing?" he murmured, as if the data could answer back. He cross-referenced the timestamps with a newer mapping tool, one that hadn't existed during the original investigation. The movement path sharpened. What once looked like random signal drift now formed something clearer, directional, deliberate. "This isn't her walking away," he said aloud, the words echoing in the empty office. Another detail surfaced, one he was certain had never been discussed properly. A secondary device identifier appeared briefly alongside her phone's data, close enough to register as co-located, consistent enough to suggest proximity over several minutes. Cole felt his pulse quicken. Why wasn't this flagged? He asked no one. He flipped back through the old reports. The identifier had been there, buried in an appendix, dismissed as background interference. At the time, investigators didn't have the tools or the context to understand its significance. Now they did. The next morning, Cole walked into his captain's office with the file tucked under his arm. "I think we missed something," he said carefully. The captain sighed, already tired. "Aaron, this case?" "I know," Cole interrupted. "I know what it is on paper. But this?" He tapped the folder. "This says she didn't vanish alone." That afternoon, the case status quietly changed for the first time in years. Inactive became under review. Subtle, administrative, easy to overlook. But for Cole, it felt like reopening a door that had been locked too long. Because once you accept that a disappearance wasn't voluntary, every assumption collapses with it. Statements have to be revisited. Timelines questioned. People re-examined, including the one person who had been there when she was last seen alive. And as Cole prepared to request a second interview 7 years too late, one thought refused to leave him alone. If the data remembered what everyone else forgot, what else had it been quietly holding on to all this time? The second interview didn't feel like a confrontation at first. It felt like a courtesy. 7 years had passed, and the man from the dating app, older now, heavier around the eyes, sat across from Detective Cole in a softly lit interview room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. He looked irritated more than nervous, the way people do when they believe the past should stay buried. "I already told you everything," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know what else you think I can add." Cole nodded calmly. "This isn't about adding," he replied. "It's about clarifying." They started with harmless questions. Where had he been working back then? Did he remember the weather that night? Had anything about the date stood out in hindsight? The man answered smoothly, almost mechanically, as if replaying a script he'd memorized years ago. "She left first," he repeated. "I watched her walk away." Cole slid a thin folder across the table. Inside were printouts, not photos, not witness statements, but data, timestamps, device IDs. Location trails drawn in quiet, undeniable lines. "Then help me understand this," Cole said. The man glanced down, barely interested until his eyes lingered too long on one page. The overlooked detail wasn't dramatic on its own. No blood, no confession. Just a background sync log from the dating app servers. Something most users never knew existed. Something investigators once dismissed as meaningless. It showed her account briefly communicating with the app after her phone should have been offline. More importantly, it showed where. Not the meeting spot. Not the direction she was supposedly walking. But a location several blocks away, reachable only by vehicle in that time frame. The room shifted. "That's not possible," the man said quickly. Too quickly. "She didn't get in my car." Cole didn't respond. He turned another page. This one showed a second device identifier, repeatedly appearing alongside her phone during that same window. The identifier matched a handset registered to the man sitting across from him. Silence stretched. "That doesn't mean anything," the man said, but his voice had lost its rhythm. "Phones ping towers all the time. You said yourself glitches." "Glitches don't move together," Cole replied evenly. "People do." For the first time, the man looked afraid. Not panicked, not desperate. Afraid in a way that suggested he understood something irreversible had just happened. Cole continued, voice steady. "Your original statement says you parted ways at 6:50 p.m., but your phone and hers stayed close, very close, until just after 7:20, long enough to travel, long enough for something to go wrong." The man shook his head. "You're twisting data. You don't know what happened." "You're right," Cole said. "I don't, but I know what didn't happen. She didn't vanish on her own." Within hours, warrants were issued. Not for an arrest yet, but for property searches, vehicles, storage units, places no one had bothered to look 7 years earlier because there hadn't been enough reason to. Now there was. Investigators moved quietly, deliberately. One property sat just outside the original search radius, dismissed long ago as irrelevant. It was an unremarkable place, no warning signs, no obvious secrets. Until they opened the garage. What they found wasn't a body. It was worse in some ways because it confirmed presence without closure. Personal items, trace evidence. A detail so specific it couldn't be explained away as coincidence. Forensic teams worked through the night. Each discovery tightened the narrative the data had been whispering for years. She hadn't walked away. She hadn't ghosted her life. She'd been interrupted mid-message, mid-moment, by someone she trusted just enough to meet. By morning, the man was taken into custody for further questioning. He didn't confess, he didn't have to, because the overlooked detail, the one buried in a forgotten server log, had done what memory and testimony never could. It placed them together after the story said they'd separated. And it proved that while time had erased witnesses and softened suspicion, it hadn't erased the truth. The data remembered. And now, so did the investigators, standing on the edge of an ending that would finally answer what happened after she vanished, even if it could never give her back. The arrest didn't come with flashing lights or a dramatic chase. It came quietly, the way truth often does after waiting too long. By the time the news reached her family, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows across a living room that had held 7 years of unanswered grief. Detective Cole sat across from them, his posture careful, his voice low. He didn't promise miracles. He didn't use the word closure. He simply said, "We know she didn't leave on her own." Her mother closed her eyes, tears slipping free before she could stop them. "I knew," she whispered. "I always knew." What followed was not a single revelation, but a slow, methodical unspooling of truth. Forensic analysts layered old data with new tools, reconstructing the night with a precision that hadn't been possible before. Movement paths tightened, time gaps closed. The abstract became tangible. Her phone had been disabled deliberately. Not smashed. Not lost. Powered down in a way that preserved data, but silenced her voice. The unfinished message, once dismissed as nothing, now felt like a scream frozen in time. Investigators found more during the property search. Fibers matching her clothing. A trace of soil consistent with the location where her phone last transmitted data. And hidden deep in a vehicle's digital system, a paired Bluetooth record that placed her phone inside the car that night. It was enough. The man never offered a full account. His attorney advised silence. There was no courtroom monologue, no emotional confession. Instead, the case spoke through evidence cold, precise, undeniable. A jury would later hear how two devices moved together when only one person admitted to being there. How a dating app's forgotten background sync contradicted a carefully repeated story. How technology, indifferent to fear or intention, simply recorded what happened. The conviction came years after the disappearance, but it landed with weight. Not relief, nothing that simple, but recognition. Her name was no longer attached to the word missing, it was attached to a truth. In the aftermath, investigators revisited other cases. How many disappearances had been written off as voluntary because there was no blood, no witnesses, no immediate alarm? How many overlooked details sat dormant in servers and archives, waiting for someone to care enough to look again? Detective Cole retired 6 months later. On his last day, he cleared his desk, leaving the office lighter than it had been in years. Before he left, he paused by the evidence room one final time, resting a hand on the shelf where her file no longer sat. "Someone remembered you," he said quietly. Her family held a small memorial, something they'd avoided for years because it felt too final. This time, it felt different. Not an ending, but an acknowledgement. They spoke about her laugh, her routines, the way she always shared her location not because she was afraid, but because she cared about the people who worried. They spoke too about the night she vanished, and how the world had almost decided she chose to disappear. But she hadn't. She'd trusted a stranger just enough to meet him, trusted technology just enough to believe it would keep her connected. And in the end, it did, just not in time to save her. The data remembered what people forgot. It remembered the movement after the goodbye, the proximity after the separation, the silence that wasn't voluntary. Years later, that memory changed everything. And somewhere in the endless hum of servers and timestamps, her unfinished message still exists, paused mid-thought. Mid-life, a quiet reminder that even when someone vanishes, the truth has a way of waiting.